So welcome to the fourth and final workshop of the Workshop Wednesday series with Women's Studies Online. I can't believe it's already the last workshop, and I feel a bit sad that this is our last session, but hopefully lots more projects in the works. I would, as always, like to begin by thanking Cherry Smiley, who has developed the Women's Studies Online platform. And as always, I'm extremely grateful to have been able to talk about the history of second wave feminist print culture over the last 4 weeks. My name is Bec Wonders, and I'm currently a PhD student at the Glasgow School of Art in the history of the women's liberation movement in Britain, the publishing arm of the movement, feminist periodicals, and the mediation of conflict through print. I co-founded the Vancouver Women's Library in 2017, and I'm a current member of Radical Girls. And I've been starting off each workshop by honoring my grandmother, Lillian Wonders, who you can see here in her garage printing press, Wonders Printing. She taught me a lot about letterpress printing and even more about a love for publishing. So today's workshop is on the topic of feminist archival theory and feminist and women's archives. All of the slides, resources, and recordings of today will be made available to you after the workshop. As I noted during the previous workshops, this is a telling of a history, not history. So today's workshop, like the rest of them, is not meant to be comprehensive. Rather, it is a selective telling through my own lens of what I think are interesting examples of feminist archives that can potentially enrich contemporary discussions of similar issues and also create intergenerational links between second wave feminist activism and similar concerns that are at the forefront of young women's minds today. In this case, I hope to provoke a sense of continuity between waves, and rather than understanding ourselves today as separated from previous feminist efforts. With all these workshops, I hope to show that the feminist archive, feminist printed material, and feminist publishing ventures all make up a treasure trove of information on which to base inquiries into our histories. So before I get going, my cat is launching a little bit of attention, so I'm going to put her on the ground very carefully. There you go, Gertie. She's been very good the last couple workshops. So today's workshop is separated into 3 sections: an overview of feminist archival theory and approaches, several examples of feminist archives that exist today, and time for discussion of what material you own that you think is worth archiving for future feminists. I have used the following key texts to frame today's workshop on feminist and women's archives. They're rich with information and scholarly analysis, so I suggest to anyone who would like to dig deeper to begin with one of these books or articles. Many contemporary discussions of archives as phenomenon typically begin with theorists such as Michel Foucault, who conceived of the archive as an authorizing apparatus and discursive structure, a system invested with the power to establish statements as events and things. Similarly, Jacques Derrida has influenced the field of archival research, most notably in Archive Fever, in which he observes that the infrastructure through which information is transmitted also shapes the knowledge that is produced within the archive. But instead of focusing on the overall male history of archive theory, today's workshop will look specifically at distinct feminist interventions in the archive, as well as the role of feminist archives themselves. We will begin with Marika Seafor and Stacey Wood, who observe in their article Critical Feminism in the Archives that various efforts of collecting on women began after the development of World Center for Women's Archives in 1935. Some decades later, parallel to the development of the women in print movement, the uptake of feminist archive theory can be observed to emerge in a 1973 publication of the American Archivist in a special issue titled Women in Archives. Seafor and Wood argue about this recent uptake in archival interventions, that these impulses demarcate these projects from traditional expectations of the archive as a neutral or passive repository, and instead identify the archive explicitly as an institution that shapes the historical record through exclusion and silence. The article traces the ways in which contemporary feminist researchers have re-articulated the need to address the unique challenges presented by feminist records and collections, particularly in ways that may seek to disrupt the discursive positioning of second-wave feminist activism. This re-articulation rests on the following understanding. Rather than conceiving of the archive as a neutral space within which historical materials were housed and from which the writing of history emerged, archives themselves become an object worthy of scrutiny and theorization. The feminist archival intervention, then, is intertwined with challenging the assumption that hierarchical models of organizing information is by default a gender-neutral activity. Seafor and Wood note that within the context of neoliberalism, the precarity of archival work and institutions has led to an even deeper intertwining of hierarchical economic structures with archival practice. Although community archives may have implemented feminist models of collective and cooperative organization, such approaches have yet to be recognized across institutional archives. They say that the investment in hierarchy cannot simply be understood as an adherence to rationality. It is a means of creating an order of social relations. We conceptualize bureaucratic organizational structures, which are by definition hierarchical, as the routinization of a set of persistent behavior. This routinization then embeds social relations structurally, routinizing not only the behaviors, but also the subordination of workers within that structure. Moving on now to a seminal work on feminist archival interventions, we will look at Kate Eichhorn's 2013 study, The Archival Turn in Feminism, Outrage in Order. This book recognizes the complex issues and questions arising out of feminist archival research and attempts to move beyond a nostalgic preservation of feminist material and towards a committed activation of feminist collections. Eichhorn explores the significance of the archive in activism, cultural production, and scholarship of feminists born during and after the rise of the second wave feminist movement. She begins by describing the backdrop of the archival turn during the 1990s, the era when feminists and women's archives began to emerge more prominently as sites of inquiry. Being a young feminist in the early 1990s, the era of Susan Faludi's backlash, not Robin Morgan's Sisterhood is Powerful, meant being always already aware of the fact that political gains, even those that appear most entrenched, can never be taken for granted. And so for a younger generation of feminists, the archive is not necessarily either a destination or an impenetrable barrier to be breached, but rather a site and practice integral to knowledge making, cultural production, and activism. She clarifies that rather than a destination for knowledges already produced or a place to recover histories and ideas placed under erasure, the making of archives is frequently where knowledge production begins. Importantly, Eichhorn draws parallels between feminist archival practices and the socio-political consequences of neoliberalism, namely the erosion of political agency and cultural production. Eichhorn argues that the increasing interest in archival interventions is owed in part to the archive's ability to restore to us what is routinely taken away under neoliberalism, not history itself, but rather the ability to understand the conditions of our everyday lives longitudinally. In this context, the archival turn should not be conceived of as an attempt to regain political agency by making previous political possibilities visible again, but rather, the archive arguably strengthens contemporary feminism as a necessary and effective authorizing apparatus in an economy that is hostile to the production and circulation of works produced quite literally at the cost of profit. And so it follows that rather than approach the archive as a site of preservation, so a place to house traces of the past, feminist scholars, cultural workers, librarians, and archivists born during and after the rise of the second wave feminist movement are seizing to legitimize new forms of knowledge and cultural production in an economically and politically precarious present. In other words, the archival turn under neoliberalism should not be primarily read as a desire to escape the present, but rather as an attempt to regain agency in an era when the ability to collectively imagine and enact other ways of being in the world has become deeply eroded. The proliferation of women's archives during the 1990s, and particularly the new millennium, is characterized, according to Eichhorn, as an extension of the women in print movement. She says, I maintain that what continues to make feminism relevant to women born during and after the rise of the second wave feminist movement is precisely their preoccupation with an earlier generation's histories of struggles, a dynamic that is most visibly being enacted in and through the archive. However, she notes that simply collecting documents of an activist movement is not necessarily a subversive act in itself. Rather, what makes the archive a potential site of resistance is arguably not simply its mandate or its location, but rather how it is deployed in the present. While archivists and special collections librarians play critical roles in fostering such possibilities, the onus is also on researchers working both inside and outside the academy to ensure that activist collections of all kinds continue to be activated in the present and for the future. At stake then is are not the worlds these collections claim to represent, but rather the worlds they invite us to imagine and even realize. It is no surprise then that feminist researchers have been challenging traditional archival methods by contending with what constitutes a legitimate archival discovery. In Beyond the Archives, Research as a Lived Process, Geza Kirsch and Liz Rohan collect accounts of interdisciplinary researchers who read the archive not just as a source, but as a subject. Archives are understood, in the words of anthropologist Anne-Laura Stoller, not as things, but as epistemological experiments, not as sites of knowledge retrieval, but as sites of knowledge production. Kirsch and Rowan foreground the role of serendipity, family connections, and cultural memory in historical research. While there may be a tendency for researchers to strive for neutrality, the way in which a researcher chooses a subject is a subject unto itself. Whether reading or constructing an archive, a researcher is also interpreting. Archival records are never simply transparent. Just as a collection of records is established from an interested perspective, it is also read from an interested perspective. The process of extracting meaning from material, the material being organized and structured so that necessarily some things are more visible than others, is argued to be in and of itself an interested decision that is influenced by the researcher's own lived experience. The tendency within archives to order material in neatly defined, easy recognizable categories is problematized in Gabriella Giannacci's survey of archival practices called Archive Everything, Mapping the Everyday. She suggests that the archive cannot be read in isolation, but rather it is relational. It directly affects our behaviors, actions, and thoughts, and it forms an intrinsic part of our economy. Giannacci wants us to understand the archive both as a set of objects where the archive operates as a noun, as well as a knowledge-generating process or lab where the archive is a verb, and draw attention to the growing significance of the user of the archive, who more and more often nowadays is also its creator. And so the archive allows us to be contemporaries not only of our century and the now, but also of its figures in the texts and documents of the past. And I really like that sentiment of being contemporaries with women in the past. Speaking to the early development of archives, Giannacci notes that archival repositories in Hungary, for example, were called loci credibilis, or places which give legal credibility to the documents kept within it. This shows how archival sites, rather than their content, had become synonymous with their authority. By being in an established archive, a document gained in credibility and possibly believability. Moreover, in late Victorian England, the archive became a function of the empire, taking the form not of a specific institution, but of an ideological construction for projecting the epistemological extension of Britain. Herewith, the archive became synonymous with its owner's ideology. Drawing attention to common misconceptions or oversimplifications of archives, Giannacci says that archives have never just been passive storehouses of old stuff, but rather that they have operated as active sites where social power is negotiated, contested, and confirmed. This sense of archives as active sites, where the archivist or researcher is an integral medium through which knowledge is interpreted and generated, must also deal with the constant flux and change. She says that the archive is about the production of our permanence. But to produce this permanence, the archive must remain in a constant state of unrest. This condition allows it to capture and transmit the changes that occur around us. Giannacci also highlights that the knowledge which is extracted from the archive is subject to necessary change, emphasizing the instability of archives as constant sites of new interpretations. She says that interpretation of the past is a process, which in itself is never complete, because as long as we have a present from which to reinterpret it, new relationships and plots between past and present are invariably forged. Giannacci argues that the archive constitutes a material site that is best understood through archaeological excavation. To dig up the archive, then, is to pursue the traces that unveil what has been. The emphasis again is on the now, the present, our presence, and on the processes of translation and mediation that an archaeology of the archive entails. The user of archives, like a detective, searches not so much for a culprit as for the transformative potential of that catastrophe that still affects our presence today, and for the processes of transmission between this past, our presence, and possible futures that this will invariably bring out. This is what allows the archive to change. So in other words, the particular socio-political time and location from which the archive is examined influences the way in which the interested subject interprets their own relationship with the material, and the archive must continuously be open to the changes of the present from which interpretations are formed. It is through the lens of an archaeological approach that Giannacci suggests we are able to address both the chronology and relationality of archival material. This approach is used by Giannacci to address the multiple layers of Lynn Hirschman-Leeson's feature film, Women, Art, and Revolution, which chronicles 40 years of the feminist movement in the US. The film originated as a set of brief documentary shots that became a scrapbook of what was going on in the art world in the 1960s and 1970s. The raw footage was then made available through the identically titled War or Women, Art, Revolution archive at Stanford University, in addition to a user-generated archive blog. I'm just going to move my cat again. She's really set on saying hello to everyone, I suppose. Yes, you've been so good, just a little bit longer. Okay. So Giannacci says about this project that the work as a whole constitutes a deep map of the field. It is a plurality of forms. It is performative, born out of another archive, offers multiple viewing platforms, and allows users to produce and consume knowledge. Giannacci continues to make sense of feminist archives as archaeological excavation, arguing that the work operates as a landfill site, an archaeological repository that allows us to produce ourselves inside a number of possible past and future feminist histories. Users, like archaeologists or detectives, search for the transformative potential of that past feminist work that so much affects who we are today. In searching for it, they disclose new relationships between past and present, the personal and the political. And in this sense, the work is archaeological, for it offers itself to the user as a set of mediating practices, translating between points in time and bringing about novel mechanisms for the transformation of the social sphere through the performance of ourselves within and because of the apparatus of the archive. So such an approach towards archival research recognizes the way in which archived feminist material may not always be situated within a neat chronology or even have a straightforward interpretation, so that the archaeological tools of excavating a material site may indeed prove useful to the feminist researcher. Karen Mason and Tanya Zanish-Belcher emphasize in raising the archival consciousness that what is at stake is a process of reclaiming women's history. Women's collections archivists preserve the history of women and help women create, recreate, and own their memories. In the same vein, Jennifer McDonald writes about complicating her students' perceptions about second-wave feminists through the archival exploration. In her article, Activating Archives in Women's Studies, she describes that before her students had a chance to examine and research the feminist archive collection, students were operating with a kind of unstated but powerful sense that today's brand of progressive feminism, the type that many had been immersed in via social media in the liberal West Coast city many students were from, was far more progressive, far more intersectional than anything that had preceded it. She explains further that these historical comparisons were not stated directly or specifically, but instead were made in the offhand way that students would refer to the bad old days when feminism only took white women's ideas and needs into account, or when a student would suggest that issues of sex and sexuality were only now being raised in an environment of heightened awareness and sensitivity. And that one of the most common tropes within the narrative construction of the feminist past, it turns out, is to suggest that a bygone feminism was not attentive to issues of race or class or sexuality. In other words, the feminist past is judged as decidedly unintersectional. McDonald illustrates how this position serves an important function for shaping our contemporary feminist identities. She says that this imaginary then makes way for a present day feminism that is everything that the old feminism wasn't: progressive, inclusive, sophisticated, and most importantly, able to break free from the failures of history. The second wave is compressed so that the third wave can be expanded. The charge that the second wave was not concerned with the diversity of women's experiences offers a narrative foil for the third wave to emerge as a necessary and more progressive movement. It should be noted here that McDonald is not suggesting that the second wave of feminism didn't have any problems in incorporating issues of race, sexuality, and the diversity of women's experiences. In fact, many areas of the women's liberation movement did struggle with intersectionality. However, McDonald's emphasis is on how the bad old days narrative is repeated, usually without citations or research, to construct an imaginary feminist past that sets up temporal divisions between generations of women that are difficult to breach. This way of characterizing feminist history over and over again becomes a form of feminist legitimation, a way to bring forth a new movement that is all-encompassing, all-knowing, even, and untainted by the problems of the past. In order to counter these dominant narratives, McDonald led sessions on archival intervention and provided her students with access to digitized print material from the Duke University Library's digital collection of women's liberation movement print culture. In situating her students within traditions or stories that had previously been invisibilized or hidden away, they become more likely to identify with the women who are featured in the material itself, and thus were encouraged to draw a relationship between history and the present. She says that students are often surprised to find figures like Sojourner Truth offering critiques quite similar to those found in intersectional feminist memes from today. However, they would, in the same instance, rattle off commonplace stereotypes of old white feminism with no awareness of how this narrative reiterated precisely the same exclusion of women of color from the early period of the movement that they were dismissing. After engaging with the digitized archival material, McDonald observes that students wondered aloud several times why they had never heard that old feminism was this diverse. Additionally, this process of exposing her students to feminist archival material showcases how the past became something to construct and participate in, which in turn allowed students to create coalitions with old feminisms they had previously described as one-dimensional foils for a narrative of present-day progressive feminist politics. Storytelling about feminism didn't cease, but the stories became more nuanced, more self-aware. They became active rather than a passive reiteration of absorbed characterizations. Come on, sweetie. She's really interested in archives. McDonald refers to this process of archival discovery as a way to participate in the construction of an alliance with the past, one that wasn't just about holding that history up as a model or as something to critique or jettison, but as something that could be in dynamic conversation with the present. I really like that idea of creating an alliance or a coalition with the past. For feminist researchers, the potential of the archive lies in complicating historical narratives that rely too heavily on signal images and oversimplified uniformity. Rather than it being an act of truth-telling, archival discovery encourages a continuity across eras and further exploration of purposeful shortcomings in the telling of women's histories. So having explored the foundations of feminist archival theory, I will now highlight some examples of feminist archival efforts. As always, with any institution that has a physical space and is geared towards women's issues, the politics of women-only space is crucial to the effectiveness of generating feminist consciousness and community. As Patricia McFadden says in her essay, Why Women's Spaces Are Critical to Feminist Autonomy, the issue of male presence in physical and ideological terms within what should be women-only spaces is not just a matter of ideological contestation and concern within the women's movement globally, it is also a serious expression of the backlash against women's attempts to become autonomous of men in their personal and political relationships and interactions. So taking this into account, there are virtually no women's archives today that have women-only policies. However, I will still highlight some of these efforts as they may prove useful in two ways. The first way is in getting you to think about the politics and processes of women's archiving. And secondly, to provide you some tangible resources you may find useful in doing your own research or activism moving forward. I would also like to instill the message that while women's archives are vulnerable to the institutional capturing of a watered-down politics, and so by and large they are open to men, as feminists, we have the right and perhaps even the responsibility to access our history and our stories and to reclaim these spaces. So in other words, while the politics of women-only space is deeply embedded in how to think of women's archives, and we may even want to think long-term about why there are no explicitly women-only archives, this is a huge discussion, and I would like to table that for another session, and instead today, focus on the tangible and practical archival efforts in order to generate an understanding of where we as women are located within the larger landscape of feminist archival practices, as well as leave you with some starting off points to continue learning about women's history beyond these workshops. So I'll now go over some examples of women's archiving efforts. Some may be more obvious or more well known to you than others, and so I will try to spend a bit more time on those examples that are perhaps less well known. Beginning with the Glasgow Women's Library, which was founded in 1991 in a tiny shopfront in Garnet Hill and is now the only accredited museum dedicated to women's history in the UK. They house a lending library, several archival collections, including the Lesbian Archive and a museum collection. Next up is the Feminist Archive, which has two branches. The first one is the Feminist Archive South, which was set up in 1978 when no other major UK institution was collecting feminist ephemera. From their website, it says that from one woman's personal collection in an attic, it expanded and outgrew various locations in the region. This is a common thread that you will notice in the history of women's archives, that they typically begin with one woman's collection that is tucked away in boxes and attics, which hopefully some of you will keep in mind when thinking about your own materials. The Feminist Archive was divided in two in 1988 when the South Branch moved to the University of Bristol and sent some of its overflow material to women in Bradford to found the Feminist Archive North, and then it later moved to the University of Leeds, where it is now housed. So today, both branches are located within academic institutions and are accessible through appointment only. The archives contain a wealth of contemporary feminist material in local, regional, national, and international collections donated by individuals and organizations. There are personal and organizational papers, conferences, pamphlets, journals, newsletters, dissertations, oral history interviews, audio tapes, films, posters, badges, T-shirts, and banners. They cover all the issues raised by and responded to by the feminist movement. Similar is the Feminist Library in London, which was originally known as the Women's Research and Resources Centre and was officially set up as the Feminist Library in 1975. It has recently relocated to its new home in Peckham as the Sojourner Truth Community Centre. The library houses a large collection of women's liberation movement materials dating from the late 1960s to the 1990s. There's also the Women's Library at the London School of Economics. This library can be traced back to the London National Society for Women's Suffrage, which later became the Fawcett Society, and by 1920 it had accumulated a large amount of suffrage literature. By 1926, its main aims were already to preserve the history of the women's movement and to provide a resource for newly enfranchised women to enter public life. Almost an entire century later, the collection has had many homes and it moved to the London School of Economics in 2013 when it became custodian of the collection. Next up is the Women's Art Library at Goldsmiths University in London. The Women's Art Library began as an artist initiative, originally publishing catalogs and books from the early 1980s to 2002. The main purpose was to provide a place for women artists to deposit documentation of their work. Today, as part of Goldsmiths Library's special collections, the Women's Art Library continues to collect slides, artist statements, exhibition ephemera, catalogs, and press material, in addition to audio and videotapes, photographs, and CDs. It has also recently developed an app to explore the archives digitally. Another art-specific women's initiative is 52% in the city of Linz in Austria, which was set up in 1998. It not only collects and promotes women's contemporary art, but also generates regular reports on women in the cultural field for the furthering of policy concerning women in the arts. Moving a little further south, and we will find the Centro Documentazione Donna in Ferrara, Italy. It started in 1980 and is one of the longest established Italian women's centers. It manages a library and archive of material relating to women's history, anthropology, economics, psychology, and philosophy. A sister organization of the same name can be found in Modena, which began in 1996 when a group of women decided to create a place for the conservation and public use of sources relating to women's history. It also acts as a regional network to support the transmission of news between other women's groups. In Germany, there are several women's archives, which I will mention briefly. First, there is the FFBIZ in Berlin, which stands for Frauenforschungs-, Bildungs- und Informationszentrum, or in English, the Women's Research, Education, and Information Center. It began as a preliminary collection of the Lesbian Action Center founded in 1973. It became FFBIZ in 1978 via the first women's bookstore in Berlin, Labris. In addition to women's materials specific to Berlin and Germany, it also houses plenty of international women's documents. They say about this material that it is special because many of the groups active in the second wave feminist movement, who often worked together for years and carried out large campaigns, did not constitute themselves as legal entities, for example, in the form of an association. They therefore documented their activities not structured in formal files, but rather through working papers, protocols, leaflets, posters, photos, buttons, and stickers, and many other gray materials. There were also records with songs from demonstrations and women's festivals. Also in Germany is the Frauenmediaturm in Cologne. The Frauenmediaturm literally means women's media tower, and was set up by Alice Schwarzer in 1984 and later moved to the Bayernturm in 1994. The mission of the collection is to secure a place of living memory for women for the preservation and mediation of information on women's emancipation. It focuses on second wave feminist German material and also includes international publications of women's rights activists. Another German women's library is the Frauengender-Bibliothek in Saarbrücken. It was founded in 1990 by women's movement activists in order to preserve and document knowledge about women's history and the women's movement, as well as convey the findings of women's research to the general public. The library describes itself as a place of active networking and feminist discourse of women's politics for the whole of southwestern Germany. A final German example is IDA, which is an umbrella organization that began in 1994, and it intends to inform, document, and promote lesbian and women's archives in Germany, as well as Switzerland, Austria, Luxembourg, and Italy. IDA facilitates regional, national, and international exchanges between women's archives initiatives. It also hosts the digital German's Women's Archive, which makes available historical materials of German feminist movements, including books and magazines, original documents such as letters, photos, and sound recordings, as well as personal possessions of German feminist pioneers of the past 200 years. Staying on the European continent, I will briefly mention KVINDE Museet, or the Women's Museum in Aarhus, Denmark. The museum was founded in 1982 by grassroots women's activists who envisioned building a women's museum as well as creating jobs for women. The museum's vision is to create curiosity, dialogue, reflection, and knowledge of history relating to women, but it also includes cultural perspectives of both sexes and is geared towards a broader audience. The collections include material dealing with both urban and rural culture that tell stories of women's generations, classes, and ethnic groups. It also provides an online catalog of all of its artifacts, which is fun to go through. Moving over to Australia, there is the Jessie Street National Women's Library in Sydney, which officially was set up in 1989 by Shirley Jones and Lenore Coulthart, two women who were motivated by the frustration of not being able to find or access material on women in Australia. The library was named after Jessie Street, who was an activist, a feminist, and a lifelong campaigner for women's rights, the peace movement, and the elimination of discrimination against Aboriginal people. The library's objectives are to heighten awareness of women's issues, to preserve documents on women's lives and activities, to support the field of women's history, and to highlight women's contribution to Australia's development. The library has spearheaded several oral history projects emphasizing stories of Aboriginal women, and it also has an accessible, searchable online catalog. I will now mention a few examples in Canada, starting with the Rise Up Feminist Archive, which is an online platform that was started by several volunteer collective members who came together in 2014 to digitize 3 Toronto-based feminist publications, KVINDE, Rebel Girls Rag, and the International Women's Day Committee newsletter. The archive quickly grew into a more ambitious project when other women began sharing their own personal archives and memorabilia. Currently, the archive has digitized Canadian feminist publications from the 1970s to the 1990s. In their reflection on the archive, the Rise Up Collective says that dozens of different publications reflected the diversity of feminist ideology and activism, and in that pre-internet era, played a central role in spreading feminist ideas and debates, as well as information about actions, organizations, and issues. In addition to the main archive, Rise Up is also crowdsourcing a feminist timeline of second wave Canadian feminism with the goal of collecting significant moments, contributions, and turning points of this era. There are also several university-level assignments available on their website to learn about feminist theory, archival research, women's protests, public policy, and feminist media, in addition to significant entries on Indigenous women's rights documents. So if you have, kids or high school level kids or university level kids, this is a great place to start introducing them to this kind of material. Another significant women's archive in Canada is the Canadian Women's Movement Archives at the University of Ottawa. The collecting of this material goes back to 1977, when a group of women at the Women's Information Centre, led by feminist author Pat Leslie, decided to collect information about feminist activities across Canada. The group contacted women's organizations and publications, requesting copies, emphasizing the importance of preserving the memory and evidence of the women's liberation movement. In 1992, all of this material was donated to the Archive and Special Collections at the University of Ottawa. Throughout the years, more than 170 archival collections related to the women's movement in Canada have been added to the collection. And the online archive also provides subject guides in order to guide the user through the material, which is really a really useful starting off point. A third notable example of women's archives in Canada is the Victoria Women's Movement Archives at the University of Victoria. The archive opened in 1995, established by a group of women who had also opened the Victoria's first ever women's bookstore, Every Woman Books, in 1975. Though the bookstore had since closed, women recognized the important contributions that local women had made to the movement and identified the need to record events that led to the rich legacy of feminist activism. A statement from the Victoria Women's Movement Archive reads that the archive was established in order to preserve and provide access to important material documenting the history of women's movement groups in Victoria. Too often, these documents are in basements or attics, deteriorating and unavailable to either activists or researchers interested in finding out more about the local feminist community. The establishment of the archives not only provided secure and accessible records, it also helps women individually and collectively to understand the importance of their work. For example, minutes and reports of local activities can be placed in a wider historical and political context that gives greater significance to the work of the women that created these records. In this electronic age, it is important to remember that paper documents continue to be relevant. Moving now to the opposite end of the globe, let's look at the Simorgh Women's Publication and Resource Center in Lahore, Pakistan. The word Simorgh refers to a benevolent female bird in Iranian mythology and literature, which is often equated with the meaning of the phoenix. The Resource Center started in 1985, and its main focus is research and dissemination of information that will enable women and men to challenge the dominance of ideas that support social and economic divisions on the basis of gender, class, religion, race, and nationality. In addition, they say that we have consciously avoided putting ourselves into any existing category as defined by Western feminists. We believe that we have to develop our own approach to our problems in accordance with our historical and socioeconomic needs. The center has produced a number of publications relating to education, the law, literature, and women's history. It acts as a network of sorts to bring together women in the community through seminars, conferences, documentary films, workshops, skill sharing, and income-generating projects. Moving on to India, let's take a look at the burgeoning new project, the Sister Library in Mumbai, which is described as being powered by female excellence. The Sister Library was spearheaded by Aki Tami when she began a traveling library across 6 cities in India in 2018. She says about this experience that through many reading interventions that we, Bombay Underground, executed in many different parts of the city, I realized that people were not reading women. Works of women were looked at as subcategory and was limited to that. This troubled me, and I looked at my own collection only to find it heavily disproportionate. My collection had less than 20% female authors, and since that day, I made a very conscious decision to read women exclusively. As the collection of books grew, the Sister Library began a fundraiser for a physical space, which you can still donate to. Aki talks about organically growing the collection of books for the library, saying that slowly my collection increased and I had to share it with the world to allow for a space to not only celebrate the works of women, but also allow for an experience to be physically surrounded by works of women in such huge numbers. The Sister Library is the first ever community-owned feminist library in India. The library has hosted events such as feminist zine-making workshops, garage sales, feminist movie nights, open mic storytelling nights, and reading room events in conversation with other feminists. Aki says about librarians that they are our ancestors, and the Sister Library continues this tradition. Aki has also spoken about expanding the library to include podcasts where oral knowledge can be preserved, and she highlights that historically writing has been the vocation of men all over the world. And in many cultures like ours, oral storytelling is where women are primarily involved. We have lost a lot of our stories in translation. And so the Sister Library is currently hosting a podcast called Sister Radio, which celebrates women and hosts conversations with women from all walks of life about culture and history to build and share ways of life away from ones that have been shaped by the male perspective, including men's perspective of women. You can follow the Sister Library on Instagram and Twitter, and remember to support the project with a small donation if you're able to. Now, moving on to the United States, there are several women's archives worth mentioning, but the obvious one to touch on is the Lesbian Herstory Archives in Brooklyn, New York. The idea was born in 1974 out of consciousness-raising groups that involved Joan Nessel, Deborah Adele, Sahili Cavallaro, and Pamela Oline. In 1975, the archives found its first home in Joan Nessel's Upper West Side Manhattan apartment. In 1978, Judith Swartz joined the collective, who was a pioneer and grassroots lesbian historian. Georgia Brooks, another tireless activist, joined as well and launched the first Black lesbian studies group at the archives. Mabel Hampton, a woman who had lived in the African-American lesbian community, also joined the collective and donated her extensive collection of lesbian paperbacks. In 1992, the collective managed to fundraise enough money to purchase its permanent home in Brooklyn. The mission of the Lesbian Herstory Archives is to gather and preserve records of lesbian lives and activities so that future generations will have ready access to materials relevant to their lives. The principles of the Lesbian Herstory Archives are as follows. All lesbian women must have access to the archives. No academic, political, or sexual credentials will be required for use of the collection. Race and class must be no barrier for use or inclusion. The archive shall be housed within the community, not an academic campus that is by definition closed to many women. The archive shall be involved in the political struggles of all lesbians. Archival skills shall be taught one generation of lesbians to another, breaking the elitism of traditional archives. The community should share in the work of the archives. Funding shall be sought from within the communities the archive serves rather than from outside sources. The archives will always have a caretaker living in it so that it will always be someone's home rather than an institution. The archives will never be sold, nor will its contents be divided. And that's it. The Lesbian Herstory Archives has also developed an extensive audio-visual collection which you can access for free online. It includes oral histories and other recordings that bring to life the rich stories of some of the lesbians involved in the beginnings of the archive. I will now show you two very short videos relating to the Lesbian Herstory Archives. The first is a trailer to a film called The Archivettes by Megan Rossman, which narrates the story of the archive. It is available to watch through Women Make Movies. And so I will play this video now. If you can't watch it or it doesn't show up, don't worry. It's only about 2 minutes long.
I want to tell tales of a lesbian life, and I hope I'm wrong, but I think this life is coming to an end.
Our history was disappearing as quickly as we were making it.
This archive, it came out of a political movement. We are still in a political movement.
We were all so eager to combat lesbian invisibility that we took risks with what we recorded and we took risks with what we left in the archive.
I came here initially because I wanted to learn about who I was, and I was the community. I wanted to see about my history and who was my foremother. You know, who am I supposed to become?
It was my family, the only family I ever had. I think harder than having it was saying goodbye to it. That was different.
It's got me a bit teary-eyed there. So I really recommend watching that movie if you are interested in learning more about the Lesbian Herstory Archives. The next short clip I'm going to show you is only 40 seconds, and it is a testimony of a woman named Lauren who had been using the Lesbian Herstory Archives. And I'd like you to pay particular attention to the way that she describes physically encountering the material.
When I first went there, I walked in and I was just like, first of all, how did I not know this existed? Secondly, I don't even know where to begin, because you walk in and it's like books and you're like, okay, books. but you don't really realize that there's so much more than books there. The first box that I opened was probably the Lesbian Avengers box, which is this like fierce radical activist group, and being able to like actually touch, you know, their banners and like listen to the tape from the answering machine, you know, like hateful shit on the answering machine. It's not just like read an article. I mean, that's cool too, reading an article about an organization, but like actually being able to like hold the stuff that they held, you know, feel the shirts that they wore, things like that I really like. And you're able to do that there, so.
I really love the way that she describes encountering the material, and I think it comes across how important it is to have these physical spaces. So another lesser known American example worth mentioning is the Native American Women Playwrights Archive, which is housed at the Miami University Libraries. And it's a bit confusing because Miami University is actually in Ohio. So some students are in for a rude awakening during Freshers Week. The archive is a collection of original materials by Native women playwrights of the Americas, and includes manuscripts and plays, as well as production materials such as programs, posters, flyers, photographs, correspondence, articles, and audiovisual materials. The collection features the work of various Native American women playwrights, including Diane Glancy, Judy Lee Olivia, Hortensia and Elvira Colorado, and Victoria Knoebel, and many others. Many of the plays found in the archive are unpublished and available only in manuscript form. Some of the more well-known plays housed in the archive are the ones produced by Spider Woman Theater, which was a feminist performance group started by Native and non-Native women in 1975. The group used a specific working technique they called story weaving, which creates designs and weaves stories with words and movement. Their plays include Women in Violence, the Lysistrata Numba, Winnetou's Snake Oil Show from Wigwam City, Cabaret, an evening of disgusting songs and pukey images, Sun, Moon, and Feathers, and many more. A lot of original materials from the Spider Woman Theater is available through the archive's online repository, and I really recommend you check it out. Returning back to the UK, I thought it would be relevant to mention the Black Cultural Archives in Brixton, London. The archive grew from a community response to the New Cross Massacre in 1981, the Police and Criminal Evidence Act of 1984, underachievement of Black children in British schools, the failings of the Race Relations Act of 1976, and the negative impacts of racism against and the lack of popular recognition of and representation by people of African and Caribbean descent in the UK. While it's not specifically a feminist archive, they house an incredible amount of material relating to the Black women's movement, including a subject guide on Black feminists and a timeline on the Black women's movement. They specify that Black feminism was distinct from white feminism due to the triple burden facing many Black women of race, class, and gender. Black feminists have argued that theirs is a very different experience, and they face different issues to what white feminists, mainly middle class, face. On the key issues of family, patriarchy, and reproduction, Black women have had different experiences and find that the idea of white feminism speaking for all marginalizes and is incompatible with reality. In addition to subject guides and timelines of the Black women's movement, the archives collections also includes oral histories of over 30 interviews about Black women's lives in Britain, the papers of Stella Dotzy, whose career as a writer and education activist and feminist spans over 25 years, the papers of Jan McKinley, who is a feminist and was involved in the Brixton Women's Group in the 1980s, multiple feminist periodicals relating to Black women, such as Black Sister, a Camden Black Sisters newsletter, and Off Our Backs, a women's news journal, and the Olive Morris collection, which highlights Morris's life as an inspiring community leader and grassroots political activist. The archive also houses many books on the Black women's movement, including The Heart of the Race, Black Women's Lives in Britain by Beverly Bryan, Stella Dotzy, and Susan Scaff, Towards an Anti-Racist Feminism by Jenny Bourne, and Beyond the Pale, White Women, Racism and History by Vron Ware, among many others. The Black Cultural Archives also curated an exhibition in 2014 titled Reimagine Black Women in Britain, which chronicled the often hidden histories of Britain's Black foremothers. In 2016, this exhibition was moved online in partnership with Google Arts and Culture, and you can access it for free, and I highly recommend that you do. Also worth mentioning is a current project titled HOWL, which stands for the History of Women's Liberation. This project is currently ongoing and was conceived of by several British women's liberation activists who wanted to preempt the media and take control of the narrative of their own history, share fully with younger feminists the form and content of their earlier campaigning, and to prevent being hidden from history. While the HOWL archive has not yet been launched, the founding idea behind HOWL is to be a central hub so that women from different groups and geographical areas can be put in touch with each other, gathering together information about other women's liberation history projects so that this information becomes accessible in one place, being a collection point for different types of historical material, such as short written accounts of the early women's liberation memories, including consciousness raising groups and local projects to post on the HOWL website, oral histories, so collecting our own and encouraging other groups to collect theirs, paper archives of individual women and groups for deposit at appropriate local feminist libraries and archives, ephemera such as posters, photos, tapes, and records, flyers, banners, t-shirts, etc. Also to construct a website, private at first, but later becoming publicly available so that material can be gathered electronically, and building a comprehensive timeline of the women's liberation movement activities. So the website is not live yet, but if you are involved in the women's liberation movement and would like to share your own material or stories with HOWL, you can email HOWL at howl-uk.org, or even get in touch if you're interested in collaborating. Another really unique archive is the Women's Liberation Music Archive, set up in 2011 in the spirit of a commitment to maintaining the visibility of feminist achievements. Their website states that feminist music making was not purely about providing great entertainment, but embodied a world-changing commitment to putting politics into practice. Women sought to do things differently, not only in terms of performance, but by providing practical skill sharing workshops for women and girls, demystifying musicianship, and challenging male supremacy, sexism, heterosexism, and stereotyped gender roles in every way possible. And also, that the Women's Liberation Music Archive exists to ensure that this vital part of women's radical history is not lost, believing these achievements should be documented, valued, and placed in the cultural and political context of the time, perhaps serving us to inspire other women as we are inspired by pioneering women before us. The archive includes extensive information about women's liberation bands, musicians, and musical projects, as well as relevant information about women's ongoing music making, feminist activism, past and present, plus other archiving projects. And finally, a useful central hub which connects all these feminist libraries and archives is the Feminist Libraries and Archives Network. It was founded in 2014 as a response to the lack of networks between feminist and women-centric libraries and archives in the UK. This has resulted in an online directory of feminist and women's libraries and archives, which you can access. I highly recommend taking a look if you're interested in exploring feminist archives further. There are many examples which I've not touched on today, such as the Greenham Women Everywhere archive and the Hackney Flashers, which was an agitprop and feminist photography collective set up in 1974. The principles under which the Feminist Libraries and Archives Network was founded are as follows: to improve communication between our libraries and archives and to develop and strengthen connections and networks, to provide a platform for feminist and women's libraries and archives and to highlight their importance, to promote feminist and women's libraries and archives to a wider audience, to support each other in various aspects of running feminist and women's libraries and archives, and to share knowledge and expertise, to ensure the continuity of feminist and women's libraries and archives, and to create and maintain links between feminist and women's libraries and archives, other women-friendly archiving projects, which chronicle the heritage of progressive social movements and the wider feminist activist community. And you can sign up to become a member if you are part of a library to the Feminist Libraries and Archives Network, and you'll get the regular newsletter. One common thread across all examples of archiving women's movement material is that the archives typically start with a small group of women who recognize the need to preserve our history because, frankly, nobody else will. These archives could not exist if women had not kept their own personal collections stored away in their attics or basements. While the prevalence of women's archives has since expanded, the institutionalization and neoliberal capturing of these archives offers a new set of potential problems and barriers. The possibility of serendipity and chance as methods of discovery are lessened the more official procedures are in place to access the archives. Rather than offering a neat chronology of events that creates a caricature of second-wave feminism, women's archives offer the possibility of unsettling a flattened history and instead offer insight into what was a dynamic and idiosyncratic movement. Informed by feminist archival theory and the examples that I have shown, I'd like us to now think about what kind of documents survive and why. So asking ourselves the following question: what feminist material or documents or objects or ephemera in my own home is worth preserving, and what stories about my life would I like future feminists to know about?